History does not begin with facts. It begins with stories that survive long enough to be believed. Richard III is one of the most written about kings in English history, and yet paradoxically one of the least securely understood. Not because sources are scarce, but because the most influential ones were written long after his death, under a dynasty that required his reputation to be ruined. What most people know about Richard III did not crystallize during his lifetime. It did not even fully solidify in the immediate aftermath of his death in 1485. It was constructed gradually, then repeated, then normalized, and finally canonized. By the time the story reached its most famous form, questioning it had become unnecessary. The problem is not Richard III. The first mistake in evaluating Richard III is assuming the problem lies with his personality or actions alone. It does not. The real problem is timing. Almost all the accounts that shape his modern image were written after the Wars of the Roses had ended, after the Tudor dynasty had secured power, and within a political climate where legitimacy depended on contrast. For the Tudors to rule securely, Richard III could not simply be defeated. He had to be morally disqualified. This was not unique. It was standard dynastic practice. The Tudor narrative framework, the chroniclers who defined Richard III's reputation, were not neutral observers recording events in real time. They were writers operating within a political framework that rewarded conformity and punished deviation. The most influential Tudor-era sources include Thomas More, writing decades later under Henry VIII, Polydore Virgil, commissioned by Henry VII, Edward Hall, openly pro-Tudor Raphael Holinshed, compiling earlier Tudor material. None of these men were contemporaries writing freely. None wrote without awareness of the political consequences, and none had an incentive to rehabilitate a defeated king whose legacy undermined the legitimacy of the reigning dynasty. This does not make their works useless, but it does make them political literature. They tell us how the Tudors wanted the past to be remembered, not necessarily how it was lived. How legitimacy shapes memory. Henry VII's claim to the throne was weak by bloodline standards. His authority rested on victory, marriage, and narrative control. Richard III, as the last Plantagenet king, represented everything the Tudors needed to distance themselves from dynastic civil war, contested succession, aristocratic violence, instability. By transforming Richard into a moral aberration, the Tudors transformed themselves into saviors. Order replaces chaos. Stability replaces monstrosity. The new regime becomes inevitable. This is not conspiracy. It is political necessity. From suggestion to certainty, early Tudor accounts often relied on implication rather than proof. Rumors were recorded as possibilities. Possibilities hardened into assumptions. Assumptions hardened into conclusions. Once written down, these conclusions were cited by later writers as established fact, and with each repetition, the burden of evidence diminished. This is how history quietly shifts from inquiry to inheritance. Shakespeare was the endpoint, not the beginning. By the time Shakespeare wrote Richard III, the narrative was already fixed. Shakespeare did not invent the hunchback tyrant. He dramatized a story his audience already accepted. Theater did not create the myth, it amplified it. And amplification matters. Once a story reaches the stage, it stops being debated. It becomes cultural memory. When a character speaks directly to the audience, history turns into morality play. Good and evil become visible. Complexity becomes inconvenient. This is the moment when repetition becomes authority. The first error history still makes, the first major error modern history continues to repeat, is this: treating Tudor accounts as neutral evidence. They are not. They are sources shaped by power, expectation, and consequence. This does not mean Richard III was innocent. It does not mean he was benevolent. It does not mean his actions should be excused. It means the standards applied to him were never applied evenly. Before asking whether Richard III was violent, ambitious, or ruthless, we must first ask a more uncomfortable question. Was he unusual for his time? Because without that benchmark, judgment is meaningless. In the late 15th century, power was not gentle. It was enforced. And to understand Richard III, we must first understand the world that produced him. Judging a king by the wrong scale. To understand why Richard III's reputation hardened into monstrosity, we must stop examining him in isolation. The question is not whether Richard exercised violence or political force. The real question is whether he did so exceptionally, or merely normally for a late 15th century English king. History often forgets to compare violence as governance, not deviation. Late medieval England was not governed by restraint. It was governed by precedent, intimidation, and survival. Kings ruled in a system where claimants multiplied easily, bloodlines justified rebellion, mercy was interpreted as weakness, delay invited overthrow. In this environment, violence was not moral failure. It was administrative currency. Any fair evaluation of Richard III requires a benchmark. Case Study 1. Edward IV. Victory is vindication. Begin with Edward IV. Richard's brother and predecessor, Edward IV, executed rival nobles without formal trials, ordered summary killings after major battles, issued sweeping attainders to strip enemies of land and titles, used imprisonment and execution as tools of consolidation. None of this was covert. None of it was exceptional. Yet Edward IV's reputation is broadly positive. Charismatic, successful, a restorer of stability. Why? Because Edward won. Historical memory often mistakes outcome for virtue. Edward's violence became reframed as decisiveness. His executions became necessary. His seizures became pragmatic. Richard inherited the same political toolkit. He simply did not inherit the same luxury of survival. Case Study 2. Henry VII. Control without chivalry. Now consider the man who defeated Richard, Henry VII, executed former allies once they became liabilities, ruled through bonds and recognizances, financially crippling the nobility, maintained extensive surveillance networks, created a climate of fear that discouraged dissent. His reign was more structurally oppressive than Richard's. Yet Henry VII is remembered as a stabilizer, a restorer of order, the founder of a lasting dynasty. Again, victory governs reputation. Henry lived long enough to commission history. Richard did not. Applying the same standard to Richard III, Richard ruled for just over 2 years. Within that period, the surviving administrative record shows no mass executions of nobles, legal reforms aimed at expanding access to justice, restrictions on forced loans and abuses of power, continued reliance on established councils, not personal terror. This does not make Richard benevolent. It makes him conventional. When measured against Edward IV or Henry VII, Richard's record is not extreme. It is arguably restrained. The perception of exceptional cruelty arises not from comparative data, but from narrative imbalance. The problem of isolated judgment. Richard III is often assessed using modern moral expectations, while his rivals are judged contextually. This asymmetry matters. If Edward's executions are framed as statecraft, Henry's repression is framed as consolidation, then Richard's actions must be measured by the same scale. When they are, the image of the uniquely violent Richard begins to fracture. Shakespeare and the Final Seal. By the time William Shakespeare dramatized Richard, the comparative context had already vanished. Shakespeare did not invent the imbalance. He inherited it. The stage did what chronicles could not. It simplified. It personified. It moralized. Once violence was embodied in a single villain, comparison ceased to matter. The consequence of losing the comparison. When historians stop comparing, power becomes personality, structure becomes morality, defeat becomes proof of guilt. Richard III did not lose his reputation because he ruled differently. He lost it because he ruled last and briefly. Comparison restores proportion. Without it, history becomes judgment instead of analysis. History is comfortable with repetition. It is deeply uncomfortable with interruption. For more than 5 centuries, Richard III existed almost entirely as a literary figure, a villain preserved by words, images, and assumptions. What finally disrupted that continuity was not a new document, nor a newly discovered confession, but something far more difficult to ignore: a body. Archaeology does not argue, it reveals. When archaeologists began excavating beneath a Leicester car park in 2012, they were not looking to rehabilitate a king's reputation. They were looking for remains that, according to all accepted historical records, should have been lost forever. What they found forced history to slow down. The skeleton showed clear signs of scoliosis, a curvature of the spine. Not a hump, not a twisted body, not the grotesque deformity described by Tudor writers and immortalized on the stage. The difference matters. Scoliosis would have slightly raised one shoulder and affected posture. It would not have made Richard physically disabled, incapable of movement, or visibly monstrous. The bones directly contradicted the exaggerated physical descriptions that had been treated as factual for centuries. This was not reinterpretation. It was correction. The violence question revisited. The skeletal evidence also revealed something else. Richard III died violently in combat at the Battle of Bosworth. The injuries on the skull were extensive, fatal blows delivered from behind, consistent with a king whose helmet had been removed and who was surrounded after losing his horse. This matters because it confirms something often forgotten in moralized retellings of his life. Richard did not rule from a distance. He fought. Late medieval kings were expected to lead armies personally. Edward IV did. Henry VII did. Richard III did as well, and died doing so. This places him squarely within the norms of his time, not outside them. If Richard was violent, he was violent in a system that required violence to survive. To single him out without applying the same scrutiny to his contemporaries is not analysis. It is selective memory. The Princes in the Tower. What evidence can and cannot say? No discussion of Richard III escapes this question, and it should not. But clarity matters. There is no contemporary document proving that Richard ordered the death of Edward V and his brother. There is no physical evidence linking him to their disappearance. There is no confession, no eyewitness account, no forensic confirmation. There is also no proof that they survived. Historians argue probability, not certainty. What history often gets wrong is not suspicion, it is confidence. Over time, uncertainty hardened into accusation, and accusation into assumed fact. This transformation did not happen because new evidence appeared, but because repetition demanded resolution. A mystery is uncomfortable. A villain provides closure. How repetition became authority. The Richard III narrative did not spread randomly. It followed a recognizable structure. First, politically motivated chronicles established the framework. Then compilers like Holinshed standardized it. Shakespeare dramatized it. Later historians taught it. Portraits visualized it. Textbooks moralized it. At no point was the story reset. It was only reaffirmed. Once a narrative enters education, it becomes ethical truth rather than historical hypothesis. Children are not taught probability. They are taught conclusions. By the time archaeology entered the conversation, the story felt settled, even though its foundations were remarkably fragile. What the discovery does, and does not, change the discovery of Richard's remains does not prove he was innocent. It does not prove he was benevolent. It does not absolve him of political ruthlessness. What it does prove is that key elements of his image were exaggerated or false. And once exaggeration is established in one area, credibility must be re-evaluated everywhere. History does not operate on partial trust. Either sources are weighed critically, or they are not. Richard III forces historians to confront an uncomfortable reality. Much of what we know about the past survives not because it is accurate, but because it was never challenged. Why Richard III still matters. This is not just about one king. It is about how defeated regimes are remembered, how victors shape morality, how propaganda hardens into tradition, and how long it can take for evidence to interrupt belief. Richard III was not uniquely evil. He was uniquely replaced. And replacement, in history, is often the most dangerous crime of all. Richard III was judged by the standards of those who overthrew him, not by the standards of his own time. That distinction changes everything. History does not begin with facts. It begins with stories that survive, and it only moves forward when we are willing to stop repeating them. If you want history examined, not inherited, subscribe to Time Teller Chronicles, new episodes weekly.